Hi, my name is Isabelle Sach. To introduce myself, I wanted to say that this class was my first introduction to ethnic studies, but I'm an economics major, so I've always had an interest in history, social justice issues, and politics. I found that this course also intertwines some of my other passions, such as environmentalism and learning about other cultures. However, looking at my background, I find myself to be very privileged, being white, growing up in a comfortable financial position. Although I faced some forms of inequality as a woman and witnessed the diverse communities and views around me from growing up in California, I know my perspective is very limited to others' experiences. One of the first moments in this class that stuck in my mind for weeks after was reading Place Against Empire, Understanding Indigenous Anti-Colonialism in week 2. Coulthard quotes a story passed down through Satu Dene tribes about a symbiotic relationship between a raven and a hunter. In the folktale, the raven leads the hunter to prey, and the hunter repays the raven with some scraps of the kill. The meaning of this legend is to demonstrate the symbiotic relationship between native people, the earth creatures, and the land. What really hit me is the respect indigenous people have for their environment and how much they weigh their impact. They feared environmental harm because they gave the land and animals autonomy to not provide them with resources they needed to survive if they did not treat them fairly. This really connected with me because I recently had the experience this past summer to live on a wildlife reserve in Costa Rica, ran by the indigenous people there working to save native turtle species. Being in personal proximity to this effort allowed me to understand the depth of the relationship between the creatures in nature and the people who live off the land. Reading the Sawtooth story of the raven and the hunter, I was reminded of the feeling of responsibility to protect the species that have been around long before human colonization, in order to repay them for living in their world. I think this lesson is an important one to always keep in mind, especially with how much environmental changes are already affecting our lives and futures. Later in the course, we connected this idea to wastelanding. Wastelanding is harming land permanently through industry that has negative environmental effects, out of disrespect for the natural value of preserving the land. As I just touched on, wastelanding has a disproportionate effect on indigenous people because of their culture. Reservations often include sacred areas of land that have history of being hunting and farming grounds for thousands of years, or even burial sites. One impact of wastelanding of protected land occurred during the uranium mining boom around World War II. The Navajo Nation was directly in the middle of the most plentiful area for the rare metal, and they were forced to cede their land to this industry because they hoped it would benefit their economy and provide jobs for their people. However, this had devastating environmental effects. Uranium was a radioactive substance, so its deposits created barren patches of land that can't be used to farm, hunt, or raise cattle, even years later. Furthermore, all the people living and working near these mines faced lifelong damage. Hearing about the abuse and lack of rights for Navajo laborers in the mines also had a huge effect on my thinking. It's impossible to ignore the racial motives behind leaving Navajo uninformed about the dangers of uranium and choosing not to give them the same protections or compensation as white workers. This is just one example of environmental racism against Native people, where it is pure corporate greed and lack of care for the lives of Indigenous people. Another concept that stood out to me in this course was one I felt like I saw in my everyday life and never had a name for. Decolonization as a metaphor and using possessive investment of whiteness at an unfair advantage. Growing up white and living in a predominantly white neighborhood in a wealthy area, it is easy to overlook privileges like safety, access to good education, and having government institutions cater towards you. The idea of possessive investment of whiteness, described by a professor at UCSB, forces us to acknowledge how power, property, and the politics of race in our society continue to favor us and systematically disadvantage minority communities. Although this also applies heavily to African American oppression, it relates to government ignoring Native people and their voice in policies throughout history as well. A huge injustice I have recently struggled with getting out of my mind is about the 18 unratified Native California treaties. These treaties are from the mid-1800s and are a result of coercive pressure on natives to relinquish ownership of their traditional lands in exchange for reservations. Outside of the power imbalances, white superiority, and misleading of native tribe leaders that led to the signing of these treaties, what really has impacted me is how they were never ratified by Congress because they wanted to keep them a secret. Knowing that so much land in California was stolen through white settler logic of elimination without the respect of making the treaties official or offering any reparations to the native people removed and eliminated has been one of the most powerful ideas in this class that has really changed the way I view the place I call home. Lastly, I recently finished reading Bury My Heart, a Wounded Knee by Dee Brown. I've read parts of it many times, but never had the strength to finish it all the way through because it's so packed with brutal realities and emotion. However, having a discussion recently in class about decolonization and how it is treated in the white mindset metaphorically inspired me to go back and read it all the way through. It's very upsetting to see how decolonization efforts through social media movements or small changes in education and political correctness end up having such little effects on the communities actually hurt by colonization. Learning about this idea from Yang and Tuck through this course, I feel very strongly that many of us who have not faced these life experiences hands-on do not treat the permanent damage of colonization seriously enough. One example of this is when I watched the short documentary about the Water is Life movement protesting the completion of a pipeline project through protected land of the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation. According to a Sioux activist on the front lines of the protest, the Dakota Access Pipeline, quote, would destroy his people's water supply and ancient sacred sites that date back 15,000 years, end quote. To Indigenous communities, this is what colonization is. Disrespect to the land they have lived on for thousands of years that harms not only the environment, but the native people who live there peacefully. Decolonization needs to stop being treated as a metaphor and refocus these efforts on the only thing native communities have ever actually asked for, returning of their land and ceasing of letting corporate greed and white manifest destiny superiority eliminate their resources and homes and remove their people. Environmental racism is defined as, quote, any policy, practice, or directive that differentiatively affects or disadvantages individuals, groups, or communities based on race, end quote. If the people opposing the project were not intersectionally oppressed people of native heritage and already disproportionately affected by government policies, they simply would not face the same threats to their livelihood, culture, and survival. In conclusion, I have seen many great additions to my life from this class in relation to my major as an economics student, as well as further developed my personal interests in social issues like environmentalism and human rights. It has taught me a lot about history of other cultures in America and the issues they still face today. It has grown my knowledge and understanding of the world around me. But above all, I have learned to listen, to ask difficult questions, to not let myself treat communities that are oppressed abstractly or as a metaphor, but to take things personally and fight for what is not right. To keep searching for things in history that are easier to ignore, acknowledge the power and privilege I have, and use it. Thank you.